Our, I think now we have our another presenter at Goetz. So you're welcome.
Hello.
Hi, can you hear us?
Yes, and can you hear me?
Yes, sure.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I apologize to Dennis because I have been having internet problems and only heard the last 4 words of his presentation. I'm sorry to hear that. Sorry to not hear that. But because I think much of what he said to you is going to be a good pretext for my presentation. I'm going to talk about the adoption of rent control or rent stabilization in 2 Midwestern cities in the United States. And this is unusual for a couple of reasons. And Dennis may have mentioned that rent control is really a phenomenon in the United States that exists only on the 2 coasts. It exists in New York and New Jersey and Maryland, Washington, D.C. on the eastern coast, and then in California and Oregon on the west coast. But for the longest time, no cities in the interior of the United States have had rent stabilization or rent control. And as Dennis no doubt mentioned, the United States, the neoclassical economic argument about rent control really does prevail in most cases. The argument views rent control as an unacceptable intrusion in the market, a price control that has really more negative effects than it does positive effects. And 3/4 of the states in the United States exempt rent control. And the 2 cities that I'm talking about today are Minneapolis and Saint Paul. They are 2 cities that exist right next to each other in the state of Minnesota in the Midwest. And Minnesota is one of the states that does exempt rent control, meaning that it controls the ability of local governments to adopt rent control. And by example, I guess I've used the wrong term, it's preempt rent control. So the state of Minnesota has preempted rent control, which constrains local government. And so in Minnesota, local governments must bring the issue of rent control to the voters. And this is exactly what happened in the cities of Minneapolis and Saint Paul in 2021. So a little bit of background. Minneapolis and Saint Paul are mid-sized cities. Together, they total about 800,000 residents. These cities are side by side on either side of the Mississippi River in the northern Midwest of the United States. Both of these cities are about 50 to 60% white and non-Hispanic, and 40 to 50% people of color. They are more diverse now than they have been at any point in time in their history, and they are significantly more diverse than they were 10, 15, and 20 years ago. Minneapolis, of course, was the site of the murder of George Floyd by policemen. It was the epicenter of many of the uprisings that occurred during the summer of 2020. And St. Paul also shared in this experience as well, being right next to Minneapolis. So over the past several months and couple of years, there's been a significant amount of progressive organizing aimed at issues of racial equity. And rent control in these 2 cities was actually was actually talked about in terms of racial equity. It was considered a racial equity issue, and these two cities have significant racial disparities in income, in educational achievement, in incarceration rates, et cetera. And so part of the story of rent stabilization or rent control in these two cities is the story of racial equity. In 2019, organizers, and again, this is before the George Floyd murder, there was already work going on in these two cities to enhance tenant protections and tenant rights. And so you had tenant organizers working on issues like just cause eviction and constraints and regulations related to security deposits and other issues that were very close to the center of the agenda for tenant advocates. So tenant protections were passed in both cities in 2019, although the City Council in Saint Paul repealed their tenant protections after it was illegally challenged by landlords, and there was an adverse ruling in the local courts. But what happened in 2020 then is that both tenant organizing movements in these cities turned to the issue of rent control. And they did so in different ways. In Minneapolis, there was a city council that was much more progressive than in Saint Paul. And so the city council took the lead in terms of initiating the conversation about rent control and actually managing that conversation as well. In Saint Paul, which is a more conservative city than Minneapolis, the city council is more conservative and did not pursue the issue of rent stabilization. And so it fell to the advocates themselves to generate the conversation about rent stabilization in Saint Paul. And so in 2021, both cities had ballot initiatives for rent control. So this was necessary because of the state law that preempted the ability of the local government to enact it on its own. So both cities brought the question to the voters in terms of a ballot initiative. In Minneapolis, it was brought to the voters by the city council. But in Saint Paul, it was brought to the voters by the tenant movement, which collected 9,000 signatures in order to get the ballot on the, or get the initiative on the ballot. So this was a significant difference because in Minneapolis, the ballot initiative was simply to ask the voters for permission for the city council to create a program. So it was a ballot initiative that was general. It was asking for approval of the concept, the potential concept of rent control and rent stabilization. Whereas in St. Paul, the activists had created a program and they put this program in front of the voters. And so they proposed a rent control program that set rent increases at 3%, a flat 3% increase. It did not exempt new construction, which is very unusual in the United States context. There was no vacancy decontrol, which is also somewhat unusual in the US context. And so there were some details that were worked out in this program for the voters. And the voters in St. Paul were faced with a very specific program to approve, whereas in Minneapolis, they were simply asked to allow the city council to legislate on the issue. Why the different approach? Again, I think the different approach had to do with the fact that the city council took the initiative in Minneapolis, whereas the advocates had to take the initiative in Saint Paul. And so the organizers were very energized at this point. They had done their homework well. They knew what forms of rent control existed elsewhere in the United States. They had had contact with advocates in California who had worked on rent control ballot initiatives before. And they put together a very large coalition of organizations. This included local unions, faith-based organizations, obviously tenant organizations, other low-income advocacy social service organizations, and affordable housing advocates. And this coalition was critical to the campaign in both cities. There were really two separate campaigns, although there was connected strategizing by the advocates across the two cities. They tried to fundraise, but raising funds was quite difficult because most of their allies were foundations who felt reluctant to get involved in an electoral campaign. These foundations were quite willing to help support programs and to help support organizations, but they were quite reluctant to get involved in an electoral campaign. And so this was not a well-funded campaign for the advocates by any means. They really relied almost entirely on volunteers. And this coalition of organizations activated their base, activated their volunteers, and created as a whole a real grassroots effort to contact voters. They created telephone banks and they constantly were calling voters and potential voters. They did door knocking even during the pandemic. They held events. They had a communications strategy that relied on individuals and supporters writing op-eds to the local newspaper and other media outlets. They were aggressive users of social media. And with what little money they were able to raise, they paid for some television advertising, very, very little television advertising, and flyers to send to potential voters. These strategies on their part were often intertwined. That is, if they received an important endorsement for rent control, they often talked about that during their phone banking. They asked voters, does it make a difference to you that Mayor Carter of Saint Paul has come out in favor of rent stabilization, et cetera? They often tweeted when they received a large or important endorsement. During the phone banking, which were shifts of 3 hours, volunteers would sit down at the phones for 3 hours. They often worked into it what they called a Twitter break, which is everyone stopped calling people for 15, 20 minutes and then went on social media to tweet about the calls that they were having, that the support that was being generated. They tweeted content that had been developed by the campaign managers themselves. So it was, as I said, a very grassroots effort. But they feel that over the 3 or 4 months that they were actively campaigning, they made over 150,000 voter contacts. And this is significant because that's larger than the number of people that voted in both of those cities as well. And they their scripts were different from Minneapolis to Saint Paul, right? Because in Minneapolis they had to sell the concept of rent control. And in Saint Paul, they were trying to sell the very specific program that the advocates had created. They also tailored the script, of course, to the audience. They found out early on in their phone calling that when they were talking to a white audience, the term rent control did not go over very well. That instead, a much preferred term and a much more successful term for them was rent stabilization. This is a term that often connotes a more moderate form of rent control. But they found that this phrase rent stabilization had almost no meaning at all for the African and Somali immigrants who were largely tenants and a big part of their base as well. So with that population, they used the term rent control. And finally, they had what they called authentic messengers. These were renters with stories, with compelling stories of landlord abuse, of rent gouging. And so these authentic messengers wrote their stories for op-eds. They tweeted their stories. Some of their stories were used in the telephone scripts, etc. So again, to sort of summarize, you had a very badly funded but large grassroots volunteer campaign on the part of the tenants. On the other end, on the other side of the campaign, of course, was the real estate industry. And here you had developers, landlords, realtors, finance people, even nonprofit developers, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. And they were well funded. In fact, they spent close to or maybe over $5 million on these two campaigns to stop rent control in these two campaigns. They had few, if any, voter contacts in the way that the tenants did, but they spent most of their money on mailings and media, and so they inundated voters with mailings. I happen to live in the city of Minneapolis, and in the weeks prior to the election, I got flyer after flyer after flyer in the mail telling me that that rent stabilization in Minneapolis was going to be a disaster and it was going to kill the real estate industry, and that did I really trust my city council to make such a decision? And so voters were really inundated to the point, frankly, that many people got tired of receiving these and began to look very critically at the materials they were receiving in the mail. And then there was one other important element that happened. In the United States, there are campaign finance laws where all candidates and all ballot campaigns have to disclose their funding. And the real estate industry missed their deadlines. They missed their 7-week deadline, and then they missed the deadline 2 weeks ahead of the election. And the tenant groups were monitoring this, and they knew that. And so at the 2-week period when the real estate industry did not disclose its financing, the tenant groups called the media, they called reporters, and they pointed this out. And within 1 hour, the campaign finance material for the landlord lobby was on the website. It had been posted. So by all accounts, I think they had these records ready. They just didn't want to make them public until they were called on it. Well, they were called on it 2 weeks ahead of time. And that's when it was revealed that they had $5 million that they were spending. Much of this money had been coming in from out of state. And so you had this idea that all of these non-local, very large real estate firms and industry firms were trying to manipulate the outcome in the local elections of Minneapolis and Saint Paul. And the tenant groups really capitalized on this. And for the last 2 weeks, that was the most prominent message that they were conveying in their telephone calls. And they were getting significant feedback from potential voters at that point that they were resentful of that kind of outside influence. The real estate lobby again in St. Paul, they attacked the specific program. They argued that 3% was too low of a rent cap. They argued that the fact that it was a fixed 3% meant that it was not flexible, could not respond to inflation. But they really hammered on the fact that the program did not have an exemption for new construction. And they argued that this would kill new housing development in the city of St. Paul. In Minneapolis, the argument of the developers was quite different. It was really focused on the fact that do you really trust your city council to make this policy? And second, your city council has no concrete plan. So you're giving them a kind of carte blanche. And then beyond that, there were the usual developer arguments against rent stabilization. And in fact, some of the advocates for the tenants were somewhat disappointed in the kind of opposition they were getting because it really wasn't tied very closely to local economic conditions or had no connection to what the advocates called the local conversation. So in the end, the polling and the weekly reviews of the calls that the advocates did showed widespread support, showed great reception of their message. But the last obstacle that the campaign met was the obstacle of low voter turnout. This was what we call in the U.S. an odd year, an off-year election. This was not an election for any federal offices. There were no compelling local races in either city, and so they were concerned about whether they would get out enough of the vote. In the end, they did, and they won in both cities 53-47. And so in St. Paul, there is now a program of rent stabilization. It's the first of its kind in the interior of the United States. And in Minneapolis, the city council is at this very moment convening and developing its program of rent stabilization. In response, the industry went to the state legislature and tried to adopt a stronger preemption law. Already, the industry has sued the city of St. Paul to try to stop implementation of their program. And there's been a great withholding of investment in St. Paul as investors have moved their investments out of the city and elsewhere, or at least are putting their investments on hold until they can perhaps change the ordinance. So renters are still fighting, even though they won the elections in both cities, and the issue remains very contested in both cities. So I'll stop the story there, and I'll be glad to take questions. So thank you.
Is this all
Ja, ist er.
activated? Do I have to press?
No.
Okay. Maybe one question. There's a paper out there by Kenneth Ayrn and Marco Giacoletti on the St. Paul rent control experience, which you may know, and it estimates that there has been property values have fallen by 6 or 7%, including for homeowners, for single family houses. And also it says that the distribution between tenant and landlords was kind of counterintuitive in the sense that high net worth landlords did not lose as much as low net worth landlords. Do you have an opinion on this paper? Do you have a comment on this? And the second question would be to what extent new construction has been affected, because I understand that in St. Paul, the controls, the 3% limit in particular, has been applied to new construction as well.
Ich glaube, er hat Internet.
He dropped off. So, wenn es weiß ist, dann ist es on, ja?
Ja.
Okay, dann machen wir das.
I'm sorry.
Can you hear us? 7% he said?
Yes, I'm sorry.
That's what the paper says. I don't know.
Did you get the question?
Did you hear the question?
Yeah, I think you were beginning to ask about the study of the two economists from California. Is that
From
correct?
California, exactly, about the property price decline, which also affected beyond rental units, homeownership. And the question about redistribution between tenants and landlords,
Right.
which is kind of counterintuitive or counter to purpose, in the sense that they claim that lower income landlords have suffered more than higher income landlords.
Right. So I'm not at all persuaded by their analysis on the second point. On the first point, they have solid data, and I think that they have demonstrated that, in fact, there has been some kind of market adjustment. And I think the market will find a new and slightly different sort of settling point and equilibrium, and so the market will proceed from that point. It will continue to sort of function well. In terms of the redistributive argument they make, I would question their methodology significantly. These are projections they're making. In fact, they had their completed months before the program was even implemented. It didn't even start until May, and their paper was written ahead of that.
And can you just comment what the yield levels have been in St. Paul? I mean, you're making the point that the market adjusts downwards, so maybe there were excess yields in the non-controlled market. I mean, that's typically the argument, right? That you're far above treasury yields and plus risk premium. Is that a healthy adjustment we're seeing, or is it going below? I mean, treasury has gone up quite a bit, right, in the US?
Yes, I can't really speak to that. I'm not sure about those numbers. I'm assuming this is the dynamic that is occurring.
And the other question was on new construction, because this 3% limit, I think, applied. I think you said also applied to new builds.
Right.
What has been the impact there in St. Paul?
Yes. So this is, of course, the most controversial element of it. To my knowledge, it's the only program in the United States that does not exist new construction. But that's going to change. I think days after the success of the ballot initiative last November, the mayor of Saint Paul signaled that he wanted to amend the program to create an exemption for new construction. And there is a majority on the city council in favor of that. So that's going to happen. By law, such an amendment cannot take place for 1 year after the passage of the ballot initiative. So, but I anticipate that sometime this November or December, there will be an exemption for new construction built into the law. So, so that's going to change already. And it's really true that there are a number of anecdotal cases of projects being put on hold because of this ballot initiative success. I don't know about whether there is a statistically significant decline in permits. There is certainly a large reduction in permits over the previous year, but that reduction actually began several months before the November election, and that decline began even before the ballot initiative got on the ballot in the first place. So I don't know that reduction in permitting is related to rent stabilization per se.
And one last question, maybe. The property tax revenue must have fallen as a result of the repricing of the stock. Is that noticeable on the city level? And I mean, wouldn't be an alternative to just accept higher property prices and income levels and then recycle the money into local government construction initiatives?
Right.
Work on the supply side. I mean, the question is where the problem comes from.
Yeah, I think that, and that's certainly the argument that the industry is making. So the decline has been since this past November, and so the city has not yet experienced a revenue decline. It will in the future, and then we don't know what adjustments will occur after that in terms of will property tax rates go up, et cetera. In terms of the question about whether it wouldn't be better to work on the supply side, this is that's an interesting question. I think that in local cities in the United States, the supply of housing has lagged behind demand in a lot of places. Certainly the supply of or the construction of affordable housing has lagged even further behind the need. And to me, it doesn't strike me as a very compelling argument to say that, okay, well, now we're really going to get serious about supply as long as you don't pursue rent control. I think rent control in one fell swoop affects 50,000 renters in the city of Saint Paul. And in order to get that kind of impact through new construction or affordable housing construction, we'd probably have to wait 45 to 50 years.
So I have one clarification question and probably a question related to the new conditions. I mean, as far as I understand, it's a typical case of rent stabilization. So you're not freezing the initial rent, but you just restrict the rent increases. And this 3% they refer to inflation rate plus 3%. That's the maximum rent increase. Is it correct?
No, that's not correct. That's just a flat 3% with no regard for the inflation rate.
Okay, so okay, because I was thinking about Oregon, for example, or California, where it's inflation rate plus certain percentage. But in this
Right.
case, it's just the flat rate. So regardless of what the inflation is, and particularly now when the inflation is high, it should be very binding. Okay.
Right. So you're correct that in most places in the United States, the rent cap is tied to the inflation rate. It's sometimes it's the inflation rate plus a couple of percentage points, but in some California cities, it's actually just a percentage of the inflation rate. Our analysis of the housing market in Minneapolis and Saint Paul is that for most of the last 20 years, the inflation rate has been well below 3%. And so tying it, but now, as you note, the inflation rate is a good deal higher. And so there's a great deal of talk in St. Paul about another amendment to the program, which would tie the cap to the inflation rate in some way. We'll have to see about that. That's not as clear as this new construction exemption, which is really almost a done deal at this point. But there may be further amendments to the St. Paul ordinance, and that would be one of them.
Yeah, thank you. I'm quite surprised that it was possible in Minneapolis and Saint Paul to vote or decide on rent control on a city level, as we previously talked about the case of Berlin or also Barcelona, where not even on the state level, Berlin is a state in Germany, this was possible. So how was it working exactly? Was it like a kind of referendum? And do you know maybe about the legal aspect, why this was possible in the US and maybe in which states and how many states something like this is possible?
Sure. So there are 38 of the 50 states in the United States that preempt the ability of local governments to enact rent control. And some of them do so in an absolute way, which is that the preemption is absolute. It would require a change in the state law for any local government to pursue rent stabilization. In the state of Minnesota, where Minneapolis and Saint Paul are located, the preemption law is not an absolute preemption. It preempts the local government from acting on its own. Instead, there has to be a referendum of the voters. And so that's what both of these were in these two cities, a referendum put to the voters to get their approval for a rent stabilization program. So, but in most states, the preemption law is, as I said, an absolute law. And so it would require a change in the state law. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much
Mm-hmm.
for the interesting presentation. And I think now we can finish this second session, make a half an hour tea break, and then we will return to the keynote lecture by Steve Malpezzi, also
Okay.
about the US.
Okay. Thank you very much.